second here. So this is what I'm talking about. In this chart, the numbers in green at the top are your retirees, folks currently receiving benefits. The numbers in blue at the bottom are active employees. And this red line tracks the ratio between the two. So you have 1.2 retirees for every active employee paying into the pension right now in the city of San Jose. Now what that means is that most of the liabilities in the pension fund need to be paid out in the relatively near future because most of the participants are retired. So when that happens, your fund managers tend to hold the money that's in the fund in low risk investments because they know if you're going to have to pay out most of your liabilities in 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, you don't want to put it in something highly volatile because you might have steep losses, but you need to be able to pay out those benefits soon. So they've been putting them in relatively safe investment portfolios to try to make sure they can pay out these benefits for all of the retirees they have. The thing is, if you had more active employees being hired into the system, that would provide more liquidity in the fund. It would, in a sense, give them more money to play with, to put in some potentially riskier investments that may actually have a higher return and overall stabilize the pension fund over the course of many years. Now, some folks might think, we know that a lot of Bay Area employers had layoffs, had a lot of vacancies after the recession, but this has been a uniquely bad problem in San Jose. So I wanted to show you San Francisco just as another example of how other cities have fared. This chart is actually flipped. Your active employees are at the top in red, in pay status retirees are at the bottom in blue, and in San Francisco, they have a ratio, they have 0.9 retirees for every active employee that's paying into the fund. And their pension fund is 87% funded. Ours is 54. So this is a huge factor in that. Now, finally, we're going to talk about unfunded accrued liability. This is a huge term that you hear thrown around all the time, unfunded liability. Now, when we talked about normal cost, we said it includes a lot of assumptions, right? Assumptions about how demographic assumptions about how long you're going to live, how long your retirement will be, all of those things. When we talked about the discount rate, we said that includes a lot of assumptions about how the market is going to do in the future. And if any of these assumptions are wrong, for example, if people live longer, if you have a high amount of retirements all at once that were unexpected, if you have fewer active employees than you expected, if the market doesn't have as high a rate of return as you expected, then you get an unfunded liability. What that means is that your guesses were wrong. You didn't pay as much into the system as you should have in the past, and now you have to make up the difference. So given everything I just described, you can probably guess that the city of San Jose had a little bit of a perfect storm when the recession hit. And what that meant is that you have a significant unfunded liability. Now, the employer promised these benefits to employees. Many people worked for 30 plus years counting on this defined benefit that they were going to receive. And because the guesses were off, the city has to make up the difference to ensure that those folks get the benefits that they were promised, right? When an unfunded liability happens, the city is responsible for it. You can think of it as like back pay to the pension fund. It's money that should have been paid before. A mistake was made. It's not the fault of the employees, but now the city has to make up for those past mistakes. That's what unfunded liability is. So that brings us to the last term, which is annual required contribution. Now, the unfunded liability is similar to what we were talking about with the funded ratio and how we make payments into the pension fund over time. It's not that important that the employer pays off all of the unfunded liability right now, because realistically not all of those benefits are going to become due tomorrow. What's important is that they have a realistic payment plan to pay off the unfunded liability over time in a way that makes sure, that guarantees that retirees receive the benefits that they were promised and that they've earned. So what they do is they split up the unfunded liability over time, make gradual payments with the goal of paying it off eventually. And so when you take the normal cost, which the employer shares part of and pays every time you get paid, plus an amortized payment of the unfunded liability, a chunk of the unfunded liability, if you add those two things together, that's the annual required contribution for the employer. So they pay the cost, they pay the normal cost to make sure we fund your future benefits, plus they gradually pay off the unfunded liability over time. And that's what this looks like. This is also from your actuarial valuation. This is the city's plan to pay off unfunded liability over time. There's some, kind of crisis scenarios where the market doesn't do that well, and ones where the market does extremely well and we pay it off sooner than expected. This is the really safe middle ground scenario of what we think is a really healthy and safe assumption to make. And as you can see, the unfunded liability goes down over time as the employer makes these gradual scheduled payments. So I just wanted you to know again that there is currently a plan in place that the city is following to pay it off over time. Okay, so that's it. Do you have any other questions?
Yes. So the city now pays a ton of money per employee into the pension. Why is it so much where it wasn't this much previously?
That's a really good question, because for Tier 1, the city of San Jose pays a lot. That is true. They pay right now about 90% of an equivalent of 90% of your salary as a pension contribution. The reason that's happening goes back to all of this stuff that we just described, which is that they should have been paying more in the past. And they didn't. Now they have to make up the difference. They can't go back on these promises that they made. And realistically, they just should have been paying more over time in the past, but they can't change what they did before. All they can do is try to make up for it now and make sure that they adequately fund your benefits. So.
Another question. Obviously, you've talked about the attacks on pensions at the beginning of this presentation. You also talked about the non-pensionable increase that the unions have taken in 1 year of this collective bargaining agreement, and what the long-term impact that could be if it becomes a pattern. So what are other options besides these types of tactics that we could see or use to make sure that we have both protect our pension, but also make sure the pension is funded adequately?
Right. Yeah, I think right now what's happening is that the city for a long time has pushed this message that the only way to make the pension sustainable is to cut benefits, right? Like that's been the message. We have to reform the pension, and reforming the pension only means one thing. It means lowering benefits. It means trying to get employees to pay more. But that's not necessarily true. This issue of the active employee to retiree ratio, that comes up in every single report that's put together about the pension. It's one of the primary issues that we have right now. And the city has something like 900 vacancies citywide. And that doesn't even include the amount of folks that we have who are part-time who might not be paying into the pension. This is a solution that is just not on the table unless we make sure it is, right? And by the way, your question about how much the Tier 1 contribution costs for the city, the thing is, if we were resolving this issue of having more active employees paying in, I can't say for sure, but most likely we would have a higher rate of return on our investments, which means that their contribution would go down. Doesn't mean that it would go down dramatically. They still have to make up some of that cost that they should have paid in the past, but it would go down because the market would be making up more of that difference, right? But as of right now, the city is just pushing this one singular message, saying it has to be through concessions, it has to be through cuts, through employees paying more or receiving less. And that's just not true. I think that's one of the best positions that we can take, because this is also about providing adequate public services, right? If we had 900 more folks providing services in the city of San Jose, that's better for the public, that's better for our union, that's better for everyone in our community. So, any other questions? Awesome. Well, thank you. That's it.